get it done, get it dirty, put it out there, get feedback from clients, from the team, and, really allow progress to beat perfectionism.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel Petitpop. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I'm very excited today to have the founder of ScaleTime joining us, where they help agency owners get back lots of time in their calendar, on average over 30 hours per week of time, through helping optimize people, process, and profits. We're going to nerd out today. And so with that, thank you, Juliana Marulanda, for joining us on the show. Appreciate you being here.
I am so excited to geek out with you today and, hopefully get people into action.
Likewise. So the topic du jour is really about the business plateau that I think we've both seen so many founders run into. You get the agency off the ground, you start selling things, but then all of a sudden it's like, oh shit, I still have so much of the work that I need to do. How do we take this thing that I've created and create scale? So we're going to be diving into that today. But before we do, I want to give you an opportunity in your own words to describe what you do and who you serve.
Yeah, absolutely. So we really focus on systems and processes for agencies of the 6, 7, and 8 figure mark. And our whole jam is for advocating for owner freedom. We really want you to get that time back, because whether that's time with your family, time to grow the business, time to start your second business, which we see a lot of, which is really exciting. You have that, and empowering the team performance, right? Because it's not just about, hey, I'm going to delegate all this stuff off my plate, which can sometimes look more like abdication instead of delegation. And then I have no visibility. I don't know what the team is doing, and then things are off the rails and it's Lord of the Flies. We really want to make sure that the team is empowered to execute, manage, oversee, and make sure that the operations can functionally thrive without you.
And this is something we talk about a lot internally, that every business, really, the founder is looking at some kind of an exit. And I think that often gets confused with selling the business. But of course, that doesn't have to be the case. It could just be time freedom and financial freedom, and not essentially being a linchpin in the business. But if that wasn't the objective, then the person wouldn't have started the business in the first place. They would have just gotten a job. And so there are conditions that need to be in place in order for those kinds of exits to be possible. And what's interesting is the criteria is basically the same. You want to sell the business, or you want to just not have it crater if you get hit by a bus. The things that need to be true are very similar. It has to be profitable, has to have good processes, have to have good people, has to allow you to, step out and not have the whole thing fall apart. So I'm excited to dig into all of this today. So the first thing I want to talk about is, what are some of the brick walls that you see clients run into as they transition from, 6 to 7 figure or 7 to 8 figure? Let's describe those plateaus and what they look like.
Absolutely. And I would say sort of the first rush for any owner is to decide that they no longer want to be a solo, or a solo with a group of freelancers, right? So once you make the decision to quote unquote go legit, as an agency owner, right? The first real mark is I'm going to make it to 1 million. And there's a rush dash to this 1 million. And what I have found with so many people that come to us over at ScaleTime is that there's a stuckness around 1.3. And I talk about this because it's really funny, because people are like, 1.3? And I'm like, yeah, it's you get to the 1 million and you're just kind of above it and you learn how to sustain it. But, and then you plateau. And the reasons why is because there's a couple things. First of all, the take home from like around 250, 300K to $1 million isn't that much different. So you really gotta have, some level of vision or impact or whatnot to get beyond that. Cause you're working harder, you're employing people, you have more headaches, your sanity is like questionable, and you're not making any much money. You're like, what the fuck? And the 1.3 is usually due to the fact that you've delegated your execution for the most part. Most of the time or most of your execution. And now you're dealing with collaboration, right? So it's, now we get into the place where things need to get streamlined because you may or may not have spent, a good eye on your profitability, right? Process may or may not have been a thing. You probably have some things in place, right? So we get a lot of people who are like, oh man, I read the checklist manifesto and I'm a convert, right? So they'll have checklists. Or, they're like, yeah, my tech stack is on point. So they have tech, right? But they may not be optimizing it, right? So you get into a place with a lot of ish. I have this ish. I have that ish. And so that's the first point where we now need to, first of all, put in collaboration and quality, right? And so that's the first step of like, we need to standardize our systems for how we do things. So not everyone's doing their own thing, right? And you can get there with a really talented visionary who knows how to sell, and a team that's been with you for quite some time and just get her done, right? And I've seen it time and time again. But can you do it profitably and scalably? That's the other thing, right? Like at that point is how do we make these things repeatable? And then if you get to the $3 million mark, like you've figured out how to make things repeatable to a certain degree. And now you need management, right? You need management, you need people to be able to actually do account management well. You need people to put out fires other than you, right? Because at that point, what we see is we've got really great teams, but the owner's still like the biggest point of failure. Right? And if someone's out, right? Like, oh, my best account manager's out. Someone got sick. Someone, got COVID. Someone's on vacation. Someone decided to, go live their life in Argentina for whatever reason, which happens in this crazy job market. You're stepping in because the owner's still the person that knows how to do everything.
So it's interesting because almost anyone that I've talked to that's seen enough agencies, very, very similar kind of breaking points in scale. And so we kind of see the exact same thing, right? Up to that 1.3 mark, the thing that I think about is, well, that's like you probably have between 6 and maybe 9 or 10 people on your team. So that's the point where you as a single founder cannot be like your ability to be the director, the person that everybody reports to starts to break down at that kind of a head count, which is indicative of why you run into these problems. And probably you can't subsidize all the mistakes with your evenings and weekends anymore. Your ability to do that has kind of been eroded. So that I see the same thing. And then 3 million, you're exactly right. First layer of management. If they don't have clarity, if they don't have process, they don't have, some visibility into numbers, how are they going to be empowered to make decisions? And how are you going to be able to let go and completely remove yourself from client work? And then to the 8-figure mark, we're starting to talk about, VPs and C-suite type, structures. And that is a whole other transition. So I can attest to those being the plateaus that I see as well for very similar reasons. So let's talk about why people get stuck at those stages. So starting at the first one, kind of transition from being an expert with some helpers into a business, which is right around that $1.3 million mark, building a team, having that function become standardized. What is kind of the first rung in the ladder that you need to solve at that stage to get through that first plateau? Yeah.
So in order to get through the first plateau, it's, you're going from offloading tasks and projects to really offloading outcomes and results. So how do we, start to, and I think technology is really important here because it creates accountability, visibility, measurability, Is that a word? I think so. Repeatability, right? And so, and a lot of people will be like, oh yeah, you know, we're using Asana, we're using ClickUp, we're using Monday, from a project management standpoint, or from a CRM standpoint. Yeah, we've got Pipedrive, we've got Copper, we've got HubSpot, whatnot, right? But it's not being used in a standardized way, right? So it's not just having the tech, it's how do we communicate as an organization, so that there's progress, and not interruption, right? Because there's two sides of this where it's like, I don't want to get dinged, ringed, pinged all day, right? As the owner, because you're trying to get work done, and that feels like, you know, some kind of delusional oasis, of actually being able to get work done as the owner. So how do we create collaboration, especially nowadays where teams are, so much more remote than they ever have been? And create structures around that, right? Like, you know, like, are there agendas to team meetings, right? Like, what are we doing in team meetings? Are team meetings actionable, right? It's the standard, like, could this be an email, you know, or are you using this to build culture and progress? So I think that's a big one. Like, how are you using your systems and how are they communicating with each other, right? So if you have a project management, are you using templates? Has the pieces of the business that are repeatable, like, are there checklists for that? Are there templates for that? Can people track, right? Do we have dashboards to be able to zoom out and then zoom in when there's an issue, as opposed to going line item by line item, because no one's got time for that, right? Especially as owners. Because a lot of the times owners are like, you know, I really love my whiteboard. And I'm like, yeah, I do too. And the reason why we love our whiteboards is because they give us the high level view and the milestones instead of the nitty gritty crap. Like, we don't want to go in there. So my antidote to being in the nitty gritty crap is, like, let's create some dashboards for you. But in order for you to be able to have dashboards, you need your team to actually be bought in, you know, tracking the stuff, changing the status updates, you know, making sure that there's, like, time tracking or deliverables or, you know, actual deadlines, not guidelines, so that you can, you know, what's happening, right? You have that oversight and that overview. You know, same thing with CRMs. Like, are we, you know, if you're at that level, you may have a coordinator, you may have someone who's, like, helping you with all of the follow-up and things like that, because, again, most of us don't want to be doing that. But are they inputting the stuff, right? So do we have the inputs to be able to get the visibility?
Yeah. And so there's a couple of things I want to double click on there. And the first is, to your point, like, we see this all the time. It's what we do, right? People come in and they're like, yeah, we're trying, like, we can't see any of our metrics. And you take one look at their tooling and you can see right away why it is. Because, yeah, every project manager sets projects up slightly differently. The same task is named a slightly different thing from one project to the next. The client name is slightly different from one system to the next. And so it's like, no wonder it's hard for you to get a report that looks at multiple projects or tries to look at a pattern across these deliverables or across these departments. There is no structure to the data. And there's, like, it's just not, for whatever reason, it's not a way that people think. Like, well, I want to be able to see this metric. And it's like, that's where the thought ends. There's not a question of, like, so what needs to be true about my data for that metric to be possible? But that is so important. And a little bit of structure goes such a long way at that juncture. It's not rocket science. It doesn't have to be super elaborate, super detailed. 2-3 levels of hierarchy that are standardized can completely change the game in terms of the ability for you to see stuff and track patterns and create repeatability. And so I think that that's a really important one, is to really kind of sit back and consider, like, okay, what are the things that as a team we need to start to make more consistent? And then how does that tie into not only how we do things, but how we set things up in the tools? I think that's really important. And then you mentioned process. And one of the challenges that I want to touch on here is, I think one of the traps that people fall into at this stage is, to your point earlier, there are parts of the business that are repeatable. And then often there's other parts of the business where it's like, we still don't really know what we're doing here, but we're kind of figuring it out. And I think that there's a tendency to want to over document everything. And people tend to not really be able to separate out, like, what's a mature process that we can create really good detailed documentation around, and what's not that mature of a process, and how do I document that piece? I'm curious, what's your take on navigating some of that obscurity when it comes to documenting things that maybe aren't quite set in stone and are likely to change or are going to be iterative in nature.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I think there's a couple points there, right? One, progress over perfection, especially for the creative types, right? They're like, I want to make it perfect. There's no perfect, right? Because, something's going to change. A client's going to do something, that's going to drive you nuts. The algorithm's going to, have another phase, right? Like, so we have to just be comfortable with the fact that the processes are always iterative. But for me, I always say you create, you standardize, and then you optimize, right? And so the name of the game is at least getting things to be standardized, so that you can continuously optimize as a group, right? And you might hire someone and they come in and they're like, oh man, have you thought about doing it this way? And you're like, oh, that's awesome, right? Now we have to get the rest of the team to get that standardization as you're optimizing. Now, as far as, not to get to like project managee, right? But there's a difference between like waterfall and, agile, right? So if you have processes that are pretty set and you're making bank on them and they work, right? And it feels like, everyone like can track it and you can train on it and it's awesome. That's the stuff you templatize. And then there's the stuff that you're trying that's, and that stuff can always be optimized, right? We're tweaking and, making sure that we're up on all the latest and greatest. Then there's stuff that you're like trying. And you're like, well, I don't know. We should, consider maybe doing this as a service offering, or why don't we, now go into blah, 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 right? And so you might have a skeleton of an idea or a notion of what you're doing. And then, you tell your team members like, yeah, like just do it like this, right? And then they're like, I have no idea what the hell you're talking about. So, what I would say to that is build it like an agile process, right? Think about it in sprints, and make sure that you're doing quick check-ins along the way, because you might have an idea, provide examples of what you're thinking, right? Like if you're visual or your team is visual, examples are always great. If you have a concept of what done looks like, you could show them, what done looks like from others. But if you're creating something completely new, start with phase one. Right? Phase it out. Okay, this is what we're thinking, phase one, and then check in quickly, because your phase one, which you haven't been able to explain well, and I know this happens to me, I'm like, sometimes, what I'm thinking and what comes out of my mouth are very different. So, you check in so that you can course correct quickly, right? Because what you don't want to do is be, I don't know, 10, 50, 100 hours in billable, and it doesn't look like what you want it to look like at all, or non-billable, right? Because it's internal, you haven't capitalized on it yet. So those quick check-ins and treating it like an agile process, or, you take it like you're creating a product and you use that agile process for those things that are super nebulous, that actually gives you a great framework, and a process within itself to create new processes. And I know that sounds a little meta, but it really works.
No, and that's exactly how we've kind of approached it internally as well. It's understanding the difference between like an SOP and a set of principles, right? It's like we don't actually really know how this is going to work, but we do know what it should produce. We do know what the outcome should be. So let's just start with documenting that, and then the how will become clear as we continue to iterate. And to your point, service area is important at that stage, but it's understanding that like every process starts with negative value. A process is actually a debt until it's used and creates value. And the more detailed it is, it's just harder and slower to update. And so if we're making a bunch of assumptions, we're probably better off just not making them on paper and starting with the things that we do know. And then to your point, like the whole idea behind Agile is you try something that's directionally accurate, you move closer to it, and then you learn things along the way. And that's why you want to stop, talk about it, adjust, update the backlog, and then sprint and sprint and sprint and repeat that until you arrive at the destination. So a couple of really good insights here. So breaking through that 1.3, to summarize what we've learned, it's about, well, obviously you have to have the people in place to offload the things that you otherwise would be doing as a founder, and then making sure that there are some tools and systems in place to standardize the core of the business and start to create some horizontal consistency from one project to another, from one process to another, things start to look similar from one project to the next. Anything else that we should be talking about before we move on to the next plateau at around the 3 million mark?
Yeah, I think it's something that you had mentioned, right? Especially around the consistency of your information. And I have a client who actually summarized it really well. We call it Tamara's Triangle for documentation because her name is Tamara. So your project management really gives you the what, right? Like what you need to do or what is being done. And then you have your documents, usually, whether it's Dropbox or Google or whatnot, which is giving you the where, right? Like where your documents and your repeatable, pieces and assets, your collateral is living. And then you have your wiki, or your internal knowledge base, however you want to call it, which is your how, right? And so that's where we're putting your SOPs, your communication guidelines, your principles, your policies, your procedures, right? And so if you have a consistent taxonomy naming convention across these three places, then your team doesn't have to spend hours upon hours a week. I think it's like the average team spends 3 hours a week just looking for shit, right? Which is, multiply that by all of your team members times what you're paying them. That's a lot of money.
That's probably pretty conservative, to be honest.
I think so, right? And so just being able to standardize and centralize how your information is being used as an organization is a huge, huge win.
Hey, it's Marcel here, and I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. If you are, then I want to encourage you to check out the Agency Profitability Toolkit. It's a free set of resources that we've put together to help agency owners just like you improve their profitability. It's full of free checklists, templates, and training videos, and has helped thousands of agencies get better at measuring the essentials of their business. So if you want to grab a free copy of that, you can head to parakeeto.com/toolkit or look for a link wherever you're watching or listening to this. With that, I want to thank you again for tuning in, and I'll let you get back to the episode.
I love it. So transitioning through that, we then break through, get to around that 3 million mark, which to your point is usually when we're starting to introduce kind of a first level of management. What are the obstacles that people run into at that stage, and how do we break through them?
Yeah. And then you're hiring people sometimes from larger organizations who don't understand what it's like to run a business, with the wallet of, cash is queen of a small business. And now you're having managers who you need to they need to understand how to make decisions, look at the quality, and have oversight the same way that you would. And so that becomes really glitchy because now we need systems and processes for managers and decision making.
Yeah. So this is a really, really good one. We're starting to talk about decision-making process and trying to and this is really hard to conceptualize if you've never done it before. And even for somebody that has done it before, it's not an easy thing to do. Like you're sitting there, you're thinking, well, I made this decision. How can somebody else possibly understand what the thoughts that went through my head? But it's possible. You just have to go through the process of actually stopping, slowing down, writing down step by step. What are some of the tips you've got for people on how to, once you have this list of things that, okay, these are some of the common decisions that I need to make when I wear this hat. How do you then go about getting that into somebody else's mind or documenting it in such a way that it can be scaled beyond just what happens in your brain?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we did say we were going to get geeky with it, right? Every decision is literally a decision tree that just happens in your brain, right? So if you can download that decision tree, it makes it a lot easier, right? So saying, okay, let's say we have, 3 tiers of clients, right? So when something happens, right, what type of tier of client is it? And then given the tier of client, for example, is it in scope? Is it out of scope? If something is out of scope, do you what's your budget for delighting the client saying okay, we could do this? Or what's your budget for saying no, we need a change order, right? So really thinking through what is it that you're trying to fulfill on, right? Based on your values as a business. What is the criteria around your decisions that you're making? Who should manage this, right? So is it your account manager? Is it your director of accounts? Is it your coordinator? Because you have an FAQ and all they need to do is send the FAQ, right? So what level, and what individual can manage this? That's really important. And then also, thinking through costs, because I think that piece is usually not thought of, right? Is this decision a $10 decision? Is it $1,000 decision? Or is it $100,000 decision, right? Because that can very easily start to segment things for you, oh crap, I need to take care of that, or no, this person can take care of that. So I think if you start to, I'm big on if you just lay it out, you can start to see the patterns, and then you can start to delegate it, and you're oh, okay, these pieces, this person knows exactly how to do this. Let's just get them to download it and document it. Cool. Or oh wow, I really have not trained anybody on how to do this stuff, right? And then segmenting some time on your calendar to figure out who are the right people, and then create some training around it.
What I love about this exercise is I think it exposes, it's a really, really great forcing function to expose where the gaps might be in, for example, process or tooling or metrics in particular. So a lot of the decisions that you would make as an owner will be based on for example, do we discount this deal that the client's pushing back on the price? Well, you're probably looking at your capacity forecast for next month to make that decision. Are we going to be busy? Are we going to be slow? That is largely going to determine whether or not you're willing to take that project on for less. What does the rest of the pipeline look like? But of course, writing that down in the decision tree and then realizing we actually don't have any good reporting for any of this stuff should be a pretty good signal. It's well, that needs to get solved if we expect somebody else to be able to make a decision based on this information. They need to have access to the information and be able to access it in a timely way when they're making the decision. And similarly, if there's documents or inputs or information about the project and there is no process around that information that is now being used as criteria in the decision tree, I love this exercise because it should make it really apparent what needs to be true in order for somebody to actually be set up for success when being asked to make these kinds of decisions. Because I'm sure you see that as much as I do, where we give somebody a title, we give them a responsibility, but we're not actually giving them any of the tools that they need to be successful in that role. And then we're surprised when they fail. And of course, we set them up for failure. We just fail to see that a lot of the time. So I love this exercise of making the decision tree. It's a powerful one.
Absolutely. And the one thing that I would also caution team members and teams that are doing this is your outliers, because all owners have them, right? It's things that do not make sense except that it's in their head, it's not documented anywhere, and people do not understand, right? And so, for example, if we're going to give someone a discount, and sometimes the team is why is that client they're always the outlier, blah, 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 right? And so it could be that having them on your portfolio just attracts clients, right? And so they have this sort of show pony status, right? Because they're in your portfolio and it's branding. And so it lowers your acquisition and makes it faster, whatever, right? And so in the owner's brain, they've made that calculation, but they haven't shared it, right? Or this client that might be a total pain in the ass, right? They could be a PITA, but they refer you 50% of your book of business, right? And so, eventually as we standardize and as we grow, we can start to eliminate these outliers, right? But as you're growing, you're documenting that as well as the other things, because those are the things that your team has no access to, that they can very easily make mistakes on. And you're crap, right? Because you didn't communicate it. And I think that level of transparency and that documentation is super important.
Nerding out, I think we could nerd out for much longer. Juliana, it's been a lot of fun talking to you about this stuff. But for the listeners that want to learn more about you, consume more of the content that you're putting out into the world, where can they find you on the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I know that running, growing, scaling an agency can be relatively hard. And we also know that it doesn't have to be that hard, right? And so we have tons of resources. I'm really big on the idea that resources are the key to success. And so definitely you can join our newsletter where we have actionable quick tips for about 5 months if you join. And you can find that at scaletime.co/podcast/profit. That'll be there. And I've got a 5-minute diagnostic so that you can see 50 operational gaps, which is pretty awesome. You can start to have a visual, almost like a heat map of your operation. And we send you fancy results within 24 hours if you fill that out, which is awesome. That's also going to be on the page. And if anything here resonated with you, and you want to jump on a call and have a deeper dive into what strategically your operational growth looks like, that's also going to be there at scaletime.co/podcast/profit.
All right. So that link in the show notes, wherever you're listening to this, just scroll down. It'll be right there. And you can check out the resources that Juliana's got for you over at scaletime.co. I'll also leave a link to your socials in there as well, for those that want to follow you and learn more about what you're doing. So with that, any final words of advice for our listeners before we wrap up?
Dirty drafts. I would say, get it done, get it dirty, put it out there, get feedback from clients, from the team, and, really allow progress to beat perfectionism.
Progress over perfection. I like it. Some wise words to end on. So with that, Juliana, thank you for making time for us today. And wherever you are listening to this, if you're listening at home, at the gym, in the car, maybe you're, behind your fridge cleaning or something. I don't know what you're doing, but wherever you are, if you learn something from today's episode, let us know. Reach out to us. We want to hear from you. Leave a comment, send us an email, hit Juliana up on LinkedIn. Get in touch with us and let us know what you are learning from the show, what you're finding valuable. And with that, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.